There is a quiet power hidden in a simple truth most people never learn. You always have the option of having no opinion. Not every word deserves a reaction. Not every situation requires judgment. And not every moment needs to be labeled as good or bad. Most of the anger, frustration, and sadness people carry does not come from life itself, but from the opinions they attach to what happens. A careless comment, a delay, a moment that feels unfair. None of these are powerful on their own. They only become powerful when you decide what they mean. Think about how often your peace is disturbed by things you cannot control. Someone speaks without thinking. Plans fall apart. Life moves in a direction you did not choose. The instant response is almost automatic. You tense up, you react, you replay the moment in your head. But the truth is simple and uncomfortable. Nothing outside you has the authority to disturb your inner state unless you grant it permission. The event arrives neutral. The storm begins only after your judgment enters. Anger feels justified in the moment. It feels like strength. But in reality, it is one of the most destructive forces inside the human mind. It does not punish the world. It punishes you. It burns clarity, clouds judgment, and turns your attention outward, placing your emotional state in the hands of people and circumstances you do not control. The moment anger takes over, you are no longer free. You are reacting, not choosing. Stoic wisdom teaches something radically different from modern culture. Strength is not dominance. Strength is not control over others. Strength is mastery over yourself. The ability to pause, to observe, and to decide what deserves your attention is what separates a calm mind from a chaotic one. You may feel irritation rise. That is human. But whether it stays, whether it grows, whether it controls your actions, that is your choice. Most people believe peace requires the world to behave differently. Fewer problems, kinder people, better timing. But peace does not depend on a softer world. It depends on a disciplined mind. When you understand that your reactions are optional, you reclaim authority over your inner life. You stop living at the mercy of circumstances. You stop handing your mind to anyone who provokes you. Imagine your thoughts as clouds passing through the sky. Some are dark, some are heavy, but none of them are you. You can observe them without grabbing onto them. You can let them pass without building a story around them. This is not suppression. This is wisdom. The moment you stop adding meaning, the moment you choose silence over judgment, the disturbance loses its fuel. This is where true freedom begins, not by fighting the world, but by refusing to let the world invade your inner space. When you no longer feel compelled to form an opinion about everything, life becomes lighter, quieter, clearer. You stop reacting to noise and start responding with intention. Today marks the beginning of a different way of living. Over the next principles, you will learn how to dismantle anger at its roots, not by force, but by understanding. Each step builds on the last, and it starts here with one powerful decision. Not everything deserves your judgment, not everything deserves your energy, and nothing outside you is worth sacrificing your peace. Your calm is not weakness, it is strength refined, and it begins the moment you remember that you always have the option to step back, remain neutral, and keep your mind your own. One of the most dangerous habits of the human mind is this. It confuses what happened with what it means. The moment something goes wrong, the mind rushes in to explain it, judge it, and personalize it. A delay becomes disrespect. A mistake becomes betrayal. A careless word becomes proof that the world is against you. But none of that is fact. It is interpretation. And interpretation is where anger is born. The Stoics understood this with brutal clarity. They knew that events themselves are neutral. They arrive without labels. They do not announce themselves as good or bad. Meaning is added later, by you. And once meaning is added, emotion follows, not the other way around. This is why two people can experience the same situation and walk away with completely different emotional outcomes. One is calm, the other is furious. Same event, different judgment. Think about how fast your mind tells stories. Someone cuts you off in traffic, and instantly a narrative forms. They are selfish. They disrespected me. They put me in danger. But pause for a moment. All you actually know is this. A car moved in front of you. Everything else is assumption. The story feels real, but it is optional. And when you believe the story without questioning it, you surrender your peace without realizing it. This is where Stoic discipline begins, not by suppressing emotion, but by challenging interpretation. When irritation rises, the first question is not, "Why did they do this to me?" The first question is, "What actually happened?" Stripped of my opinion. That single question creates space, and space is power. In that space, anger loses its urgency. It no longer feels like a command. It becomes information you can observe rather than obey. Most people never practice this separation. They live fused to their interpretations. Every inconvenience becomes personal. Every obstacle becomes an insult. Over time, this creates a life of constant tension because the world will never align with your expectations. But when you learn to separate events from meaning, something changes. You stop reacting automatically. You stop feeding anger with imaginary narratives. This does not mean you become passive or naive. It means you become precise. You deal with reality as it is, not as your emotions exaggerate it to be. A delay is a delay. A comment is a comment. A mistake is a mistake. None of these require you to suffer internally unless you decide they do. The Stoics trained themselves to revoke judgments the moment they appeared, not later, not after the damage was done. Immediately, they understood that the mind, if left unchecked, will always choose the most emotionally charged explanation. And emotional explanations feel convincing, but they are rarely useful. When you practice separating facts from stories, anger weakens at its root. You no longer argue with reality. You no longer demand that the world behave differently so you can be at peace. You adjust your perception instead. And perception is the one thing fully under your control. This is the shift that changes everything. The world does not calm down. People do not suddenly improve. Life remains unpredictable. But you stop adding unnecessary suffering to neutral moments. You stop multiplying pain with imagination. You begin responding with clarity instead of reacting with emotion. From this point forward, whenever something disturbs you, remember this. The event is outside your control, but the meaning you assign to it is not. And the moment you reclaim that power, you take the first real step toward emotional freedom. If separating events from meaning is the foundation, then mastering the voice in your head is the structure built on top of it. Because even after you recognize that an event is neutral, the inner voice will try to drag you back into old patterns. That voice comments, judges, exaggerates, and repeats. It replays moments you should have already moved past and turns small issues into personal attacks. The Stoics understood that no external enemy is as dangerous as an undisciplined inner dialogue, because this is the voice that decides whether anger fades quickly or stays long enough to poison your peace. Most anger does not come from what happens, but from what your mind keeps saying afterward. A single comment can echo for hours, not because it was powerful, but because your inner voice keeps giving it attention. The moment you realize this, you gain leverage. You begin to see that you are not obligated to believe every thought that appears in your mind. Thoughts are suggestions, not commands. The Stoics trained themselves to catch the first judgment before it hardened into emotion. The moment the thought appears, "This is unbearable," or "They disrespected me," you pause and label it for what it is, an interpretation, not a fact. That pause weakens the thought's authority. Instead of repeating the same angry script, you replace it with a calmer truth. They acted according to their nature, not mine. I control my response, not their behavior. This is not self-deception. This is self-command. Over time, the way you speak to yourself determines the quality of your inner life. If your inner voice is harsh, dramatic, and accusatory, anger will feel constant and justified. But when your inner voice becomes calm, rational, and disciplined, anger has nowhere to stay. You stop escalating situations in your own mind. You stop reliving moments that no longer exist. You begin to guide yourself instead of attacking yourself. This is why the Stoics reflected daily, reviewing their thoughts, correcting errors, and refining their inner speech. They knew that the mind, left alone, does not drift toward wisdom, it drifts toward chaos. Mastering the inner voice is not about silencing it completely. It is about training it to serve you instead of sabotage you. And once you gain control over that voice, you are ready for the next step, learning how to create space between impulse and action, because awareness alone is not enough unless it is followed by restraint. If mastering the voice in your head gives you awareness, then learning to pause gives you power, because awareness without restraint still leaves room for regret. Most anger is not dangerous because it exists, but because it moves too fast. It jumps from stimulus to reaction without giving reason a chance to step in. The Stoics understood this deeply. They knew that the smallest delay between what happens and what you do next can completely change the outcome of a moment, a conversation, or even a life. Anger thrives on speed. It wants an immediate response, a sharp word, a slammed door, a reckless decision. But wisdom lives in slowness. It lives in the space where you stop, breathe, and choose. When Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that he had power over his mind and not outside events, he was reminding himself to pause before reacting, because reaction is surrender, but response is control. Think about how many situations in your life escalated simply because you responded too quickly. A message that could have been ignored turned into an argument. A moment of frustration turned into words you later wished you could take back. A brief inconvenience ruined an entire day. None of these moments required anger, but anger rushed in because there was no pause to stop it. The Stoic pause is not weakness or avoidance, it is discipline. It is the deliberate choice to not hand your power to the moment. Even a few seconds are enough. A slow breath, a silent count, a reminder that nothing external can force you to lose control unless you agree. This pause interrupts the emotional chain reaction and returns authority to you. Over time, this space becomes familiar. You no longer feel the urge to immediately defend, explain, or attack. You begin to see how temporary most triggers are. What felt urgent loses its urgency. What felt personal loses its weight. The pause allows anger to burn itself out before it turns into action. This is why Seneca called delay the greatest remedy for anger. Delay exposes how fragile anger really is. Left unfed, it collapses on its own. Practicing the pause in small moments is how you prepare for bigger ones. When plans change, when someone speaks carelessly, when something goes wrong, you pause, you breathe. You remind yourself that dignity is worth more than emotional release. Over time, this discipline reshapes your character. People notice that you are harder to provoke. Situations that once controlled you no longer do. You stop being reactive and start becoming deliberate. And once you learn to pause, you are ready for a deeper challenge, learning how to stop taking other people's behavior as a personal attack, because true calm cannot exist as long as you internalize what does not belong to you. Once you have learned to pause instead of reacting, the next layer of mastery becomes clear. You must stop making other people's behavior about you, because anger survives only when you internalize what was never yours to carry. Most emotional pain does not come from what is said or done, but from the meaning you attach to it. An insult hurts because you accept it as a judgment of your worth. Criticism stings because you allow it to define you. Disrespect lingers because you replay it as proof that something is wrong with you. The Stoics saw this as a fundamental error of perception. Epictetus taught that people speak and act according to what seems right to them, not according to the truth of who you are. When someone lashes out, mocks, or belittles, they are revealing their inner state, not making a factual statement about your value. Most people project outward what they cannot resolve inward. Their anger, insecurity, fear, or bitterness looks for an exit, and you happen to be nearby. When you understand this, insults lose their poison. They stop feeling like arrows aimed at your identity and start looking like noise from an unsettled mind. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that choosing not to feel harmed is what keeps you unharmed, because words only gain power when you invite them in. Think about how many times you have suffered twice from a single moment, once when the words were spoken, and again when you repeated them in your mind, dissected them, argued with them, and carried them long after the moment had passed. That second suffering is optional. It is self-inflicted. When you stop taking things personally, you interrupt this cycle. You no longer pick up what was thrown at you. You let it fall. This does not mean you become passive or weak. It means you become selective. You decide what deserves your emotional energy and what does not. You can still set boundaries, correct behavior, or walk away. But you do so without rage and without losing yourself. There is immense strength in indifference, not the cold indifference of apathy, but the disciplined indifference of someone who knows their worth does not fluctuate with opinions. Imagine holding something precious in your hand, something of real value. If someone nearby claims it is worthless, does its value change, or does their statement simply reveal their ignorance? Your character works the same way. The Stoics trained themselves to see insults as reflections, not attacks. Reflections of the speaker's confusion, pain, or immaturity. Once you adopt this perspective, silence becomes easier. You no longer feel compelled to defend, explain, or prove yourself. Silence becomes a statement of self-respect. It tells the world that you are not governed by emotional reflexes. Over time, this detachment creates freedom. You stop monitoring how others perceive you. You stop measuring yourself against careless words. You move through the world with a lighter mind because you are no longer carrying other people's unresolved issues on your back. This is why Stoicism teaches that the quickest way to lose peace is to hand over your inner world to external opinions. When you reclaim that authority, anger has nowhere to settle. You become harder to offend, not because you are numb, but because you are clear. Clear about who you are, clear about what matters, and clear about what does not. And when nothing feels personal anymore, letting go becomes natural, because there is nothing left to cling to, which leads directly into the next discipline, learning how to release anger quickly before it takes root and poisons your mind. At this final stage, everything comes together, because even if you understand events, master your inner voice, pause before reacting, and stop taking things personally, anger will still return if you cling to it. The last discipline of Stoic calm is learning to release anger quickly and anchor yourself in the present moment, because holding on is a choice, and it is one that always costs you more than it costs anyone else. Seneca warned that anger, if not restrained, becomes more harmful than the injury that caused it. And this is not poetic exaggeration. When you replay an argument in your mind, rehearse what you should have said, or imagine future confrontations, you are reopening the wound again and again. The event happened once, but your mind keeps reliving it. This is how a single moment turns into days of tension, sleepless nights, and quiet bitterness. The Stoics saw this as unnecessary suffering. They believed that once a moment has passed, it no longer deserves residence in your mind unless it offers a lesson. Anything beyond that is poison. Letting go quickly is not denial, it is discipline. It is the decision to refuse the second wound, the wound you inflict on yourself by clinging to what you cannot change. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that the best revenge is not to become like the person who harmed you, because the moment you carry their anger, you mirror their weakness. When you let go, you reclaim your dignity. Practically, this begins with honesty. You must notice when you are holding anger and name it without justifying it. Not, "I'm right to be angry," but simply, "I am holding anger." That awareness creates the option to release it. Then comes choice. Ask yourself whether this feeling improves your life or drains it. If there is action to be taken, take it calmly. If there is nothing to be done, release the emotion and move forward. This is how anger transforms into clarity instead of bitterness. But release alone is not enough. The mind needs an anchor, and Stoicism offers the most powerful one, the present moment. Much of anger lives in the past or the imagined future. You replay what happened, or you fear what might happen next. Rarely are you angry about what exists right now. Seneca observed that we suffer more in imagination than in reality, and this is especially true with resentment. The present moment, when observed honestly, is almost always manageable. Your breath is steady, the ground supports you. The moment itself is neutral. By returning your attention to what is happening now, you remove fuel from anger. You stop feeding it with memory and speculation. Marcus Aurelius disciplined himself to confine his attention to the present, not because the future did not matter, but because peace only exists now. When you live here, insults lose their echo, delays lose their drama, and frustrations lose their weight. You begin to respond instead of react, to choose instead of explode. Over time, this practice reshapes your character. You become someone who is difficult to provoke, not because life is gentle, but because your mind is trained. You expect imperfection. You interpret events clearly. You guide your inner voice. You pause. You detach. You release. And finally, you remain present. This is the Stoic path to being unshakable. Not emotionless, but steady. Not passive, but grounded. Not detached from life, but aligned with it. Anger no longer controls your days. It becomes a signal, not a sentence. Something to observe, learn from, and release. When you live this way, the world may remain chaotic, people may remain flawed, and life may remain unpredictable, but your inner world stays ordered. And that is true freedom. Not the absence of challenges, but mastery over your response to them. When you stop giving anger a home in your mind, peace becomes your default state. This is not something you achieve once. It is something you practice daily. And with each practice, you become calmer, clearer, and stronger. The Stoics left us this discipline not as theory, but as a way of living. And the moment you choose to apply it, you stop being ruled by emotion and start living with quiet, deliberate power.